October 27, 2020. A volunteer search team combing through the dense forests of Yellowstone National Park made a discovery that would transform a presumed accident into something far more sinister. Lying beneath a thin layer of pine needles, partially concealed at the base of a Douglas fir, was a GoPro body camera in its protective housing. The camera belonged to Emily Carson, a 29-year-old park ranger whose body had been found 8 days earlier at the bottom of a rocky ravine. The camera's battery was dead, but its memory card held 17 minutes of recorded audio that, according to digital forensics experts, continued well after Emily Carson could not possibly have been alive to record it. The discovery came on the 6th day of what had initially been classified as a tragic workplace accident. Emily Carson had disappeared on October 14th while conducting a routine patrol in the remote Specimen Ridge area of Yellowstone's northern sector. When she failed to check in for her scheduled evening radio contact at 6 p.m., her colleagues had assumed equipment failure. By 8 p.m., when she still hadn't returned to the ranger station, alarm bells began ringing. Before we begin the story, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We're really curious where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a rating. For 5 days, teams of rangers, search and rescue volunteers, and tracking dogs scoured the backcountry. On October 19th, they found Emily Carson at the base of a steep rock face, nestled in a narrow crevice that would have been nearly impossible to spot from above. The location was 4.8 kilometers from her last known radio position. The initial assessment seemed straightforward. Emily had apparently fallen from the cliff above, tumbling into the hidden ravine below. Such accidents, while uncommon, were not unprecedented in Yellowstone's rugged wilderness. Park officials prepared statements about the inherent risks of backcountry work. Emily's family began making funeral arrangements. But the discovery of the body camera 8 days later changed everything. Emily Carson had come to Yellowstone 4 years earlier, relocating from California with the kind of idealistic energy that park veterans recognized immediately. She had specialized in rare species protection, focusing on the park's populations of gray wolves, grizzly bears, and bald eagles. Her dedication was evident in everything she did. She maintained a popular blog about her work, sharing photographs and stories with 35,000 followers who lived vicariously through her adventures in America's first national park. Her colleagues described Emily as meticulous, principled, someone who checked every detail twice. Mark Holloway, who had worked as Emily's patrol partner for the previous 2 years, later told investigators that Emily knew the backcountry trails better than rangers with twice her experience. She didn't just hike these routes, Holloway explained. She studied them. She knew which ravines flooded in spring, which ridges caught the worst winter winds, where the bears denned. Emily didn't make careless mistakes. Mark Holloway was 32 years old in October 2020. A senior ranger with 6 years of park service, he had been the one who insisted the search continue beyond the standard 72-hour window. While other officials began preparing for a recovery operation rather than a rescue, Holloway pushed for additional search teams. He barely slept during those 5 days, returning to the search area each morning looking increasingly haggard. On the evening of October 18th, Holloway had given a brief interview to a local news crew. Standing outside the ranger station, exhaustion evident in every line of his face, he'd said something that would later take on additional significance. Emily knew these trails like the back of her hand. She didn't just stumble and fall. Something else happened out there. At the time, his words were interpreted as grief-driven denial, a colleague refusing to accept the random cruelty of an accident. But the discovery of the camera would prove Holloway's instincts correct. The third key figure in the story was David Coleman, a 28-year-old rookie ranger who had been transferred to Emily's sector just 2 months before her disappearance. Coleman was still learning the rhythms of backcountry patrol work, and Emily had taken him under her wing. He later described her as a natural mentor, patient but exacting, someone who taught by example. On October 14th, David Coleman had been assigned to a different patrol route, working an area about 15 kilometers south of Emily's assigned sector. He'd returned to the station at 4:40 p.m., completed his paperwork, and was preparing to head home when the evening radio check failed to raise Emily. Coleman was the first to officially report her missing, following protocol by notifying the sector supervisor when the 6 p.m. contact went unanswered. In interviews with investigators, Coleman recalled Emily's demeanor in the days leading up to her disappearance. "She seemed tense that last week," he said. "I asked if everything was okay. She told me, 'Everything will be clear soon.' I didn't know what she meant." The sector supervisor was Robert Griffin, 34 years old at the time, with 12 years of park service behind him. Griffin had been responsible for coordinating the search operation, managing teams, allocating resources, and serving as liaison with park administration. His approach was methodical and by the book. When asked about the incident, Griffin emphasized the inherent dangers of the terrain. "The northern sector has challenging topography," he explained to a review board. "Unfortunately, this isn't the first accident I've overseen in my career. We do everything possible to maintain safety, but wilderness work carries inherent risks." Griffin had ordered the temporary closure of several dangerous trail sections following Emily's death, a standard precautionary measure. He appeared shaken but professional during the initial investigation, his responses crisp and protocol-focused. The discovery of Emily's body camera on October 27th came courtesy of Jessica Morrow, a volunteer who had continued searching even after the official operation concluded. Morrow was working a grid pattern in an area roughly 200 meters from where Emily's body had been found when she noticed something black beneath the layer of brown pine needles. The camera's distinctive shape was unmistakable. Morrow immediately radioed the ranger station. Within an hour, the camera was in the hands of county sheriff's deputies who had assumed jurisdiction over what was still, at that point, being treated as an accidental death investigation. The camera's placement was the first anomaly that investigators noted. 200 meters from the body, but not along any logical trajectory from the cliff above. If Emily had been wearing the camera when she fell, and it had somehow detached during the tumble, it should have been found much closer to where she landed, or perhaps somewhere along the fall line. Instead, it lay in a direction that didn't align with the accident theory. The camera's protective housing showed no significant damage. The mounting clip that should have attached it to Emily's tactical vest was present, but the quick-release buckle was open, not broken. Someone had unfastened it deliberately. The memory card held 17 minutes and 23 seconds of recorded data. The timestamp showed the recording had begun at 2:28 p.m. on October 14th. Emily's last radio contact with the ranger station had been logged at 2:22 p.m. She'd reported checking for signs of animal activity near Hidden Lake and signed off with a routine "all clear" message. 6 minutes later, her camera started recording. The first viewing of the footage took place in a small conference room at the county sheriff's office. Present were the lead investigator, a digital forensics specialist, Robert Griffin as the Park Service representative, and a county prosecutor. The video portion of the recording was largely useless. The camera had been facing downward, recording only glimpses of forest floor, pine needles, and occasional patches of sky visible through the canopy. The lens was partially obscured for much of the recording. But the audio was crystal clear. And what it captured would transform this case from a tragic accident into a criminal investigation. The first sounds were unmistakable: heavy breathing, the rustle of fabric against fabric, a male voice, strained and urgent. "You don't understand what you've done." The words were followed by more sounds of movement, of exertion. Then Emily's voice, breathless but defiant. "I understand perfectly." The recording continued. Footsteps. The crack of branches breaking. Long stretches where only ambient forest sounds were audible. Wind in the trees, the distant call of a raven. Then, at 8 minutes and 13 seconds into the recording, Emily's voice again, more distant now, but still distinct. "You can't hide this. The letter has already been sent." A male voice responded, but the words were too faint to distinguish. More sounds of movement followed. At 14 minutes and 21 seconds, a different sound emerged. Something being dragged across rocks. A grinding scrape that the audio forensic specialist would later identify as consistent with a heavy weight being pulled over rough stone. At 17 minutes exactly, the recording ended. The battery had finally died. The investigators sat in silence after the playback finished. The prosecutor was the first to speak. "That's not an accident." Within hours, the county medical examiner was conducting a second, more thorough examination of Emily Carson's remains. Park Service officials were pulling radio logs, GPS data, and personnel files. The camera's audio was sent to a specialized lab for voice analysis and enhancement. Robert Griffin, still present in his capacity as park liaison, appeared visibly shaken. "I don't understand," he said. "Who else was out there with her?" That question would drive the investigation for the next 3 weeks. But first, investigators needed to examine Emily Carson's life in the days and weeks before she disappeared. What had she been investigating? What letter had she referenced in those captured words? The answers began emerging when forensic analysts gained access to Emily's work email account. Buried among routine correspondence about trail conditions and wildlife sightings was a message sent on October 8th, 6 days before her disappearance. The recipient was listed as Regional Administration, Confidential Review. The subject line read, "Systematic Protocol Violations, Northern Sector 7, Request for External Investigation." The email's contents were explosive. Emily Carson had documented a pattern of irregularities in the official records concerning problem animals that had been removed from the park. Over an 8-month period, 4 grizzly bears had been officially reported as destroyed following incidents involving threats to visitors or livestock on adjacent private land. Standard protocol required detailed paperwork for each incident. Incident reports, authorization forms, disposal records. Emily's investigation had revealed something troubling. While 4 bears appeared in the official incident reports, she had found documentation for 7 bear carcasses that had been removed from park grounds during the same period. 3 additional bears had somehow been taken from parkland without corresponding incident reports. The paperwork for these animals had simply vanished from the official filing system. Similar discrepancies existed for elk, deer, and 1 gray wolf. Animals were disappearing from Yellowstone's wilderness, but the required documentation didn't exist. Emily had spent weeks cross-referencing records, photographing documents, and building a case. She'd created a backup archive on her personal cloud storage, and she'd been in contact with an independent wildlife ecologist about her findings. The email to regional administration was her attempt to trigger an internal investigation. "I have documented evidence of systematic violations of Park Service protocols regarding wildlife removal," she wrote. I believe these irregularities may indicate illegal activity. I am requesting immediate external review by personnel not affiliated with Northern Sector operations. Investigators immediately attempted to determine who had received Emily's October 8th email and what response, if any, had been generated. The answer would prove central to understanding what happened on October 14th. But first, they needed to analyze the other piece of critical evidence that had been with Emily when her body was discovered. Her personal GPS tracker, a mandatory piece of equipment for rangers conducting backcountry patrols, had been found in her jacket pocket. The device's internal memory told a story that contradicted the accident theory even more dramatically than the camera's audio. The GPS tracker data revealed a timeline that made no sense under the accident scenario. The device showed Emily's position had remained static from 2:36 p.m. until 3:52 p.m. in a location approximately 1.2 kilometers from where her body was eventually discovered. For over an hour, she hadn't moved at all. Then, at 3:52 p.m., the tracker recorded sudden movement, covering that 1.2-kilometer distance in just 8 minutes. The speed was impossible for someone walking injured terrain. It was barely plausible for someone running at full sprint through dense forest. But most significantly, the direction of movement was away from any established trail, heading directly toward the ravine where she would be found. After 4 p.m., the GPS signal became stationary again, this time at the location where search teams would discover her body 5 days later. A digital forensics specialist named Patricia Chen spent 2 days analyzing the data. Her report was unambiguous. The movement pattern at 3:52 p.m. is inconsistent with self-directed locomotion by the tracker's wearer. The consistency of speed, the straight-line trajectory ignoring terrain obstacles, and the absence of the small positional variations typical of walking or running all suggest the tracker was being transported by someone other than Ranger Carson. In simpler terms, someone had moved Emily's body more than an hour after the incident captured on her camera. Investigators now faced uncomfortable questions about the 3 rangers who had been on duty in the Northern Sector on October 14th. Mark Holloway, Emily's regular partner, had been assigned to an adjacent patrol area that day. David Coleman had been working 15 kilometers south. And Robert Griffin, the sector supervisor, should have been at the main ranger station, 40 kilometers from Emily's position. All 3 men were asked to provide detailed accounts of their movements that day. Mark Holloway's statement was straightforward. He'd been conducting routine inspection of a remote weather monitoring station in a canyon area known for poor radio reception. I left the main station at 10:15 a.m., he explained. The weather station is in a box canyon where radio signals don't penetrate. I performed standard maintenance, replaced batteries, downloaded data files. I emerged from the canyon around 3:45 p.m. and immediately radioed in. That was my first communication since entering the dead zone. Investigators checked the radio logs. Holloway's statement was accurate. His radio had been silent from 10:30 a.m. until 3:47 p.m. But that silence, which matched his explanation, also meant he had no alibi for the critical period when Emily's GPS showed she was stationary and then moved. The weather station he'd been servicing was approximately 3 kilometers from where Emily's GPS placed her at 2:36 p.m. Through difficult terrain, that represented perhaps 45 minutes of hard hiking for someone who knew the backcountry well, someone like Mark Holloway. A polygraph examination was arranged. Holloway agreed immediately. The results came back inconclusive. The examiner noted significant stress responses, but stressed that grief and anxiety over a colleague's death could easily produce such readings. "He's definitely stressed," the examiner reported, "but I can't determine if that stress indicates deception or simply emotional trauma." David Coleman's statement placed him far from Emily's location. His GPS tracker confirmed he'd been working his assigned sector throughout the afternoon, never coming within 10 kilometers of where Emily had been. His radio logs showed regular check-ins every 30 minutes, exactly as protocol required. Unless Coleman had somehow abandoned his assigned patrol, traveled 10 kilometers through wilderness, committed murder, transported a body, and returned to his sector without his GPS tracker or radio communications revealing the deviation, he could not have been directly involved. But investigators noticed something in Coleman's initial statement. When asked about Emily's demeanor in the days before her disappearance, he'd mentioned she seemed tense and had said something about everything being clear soon. When pressed for more details, Coleman added something new. "About a week before she disappeared, maybe October 7th or 8th, I saw Emily photographing documents in the office after hours. I asked what she was doing. She said she was making copies of some paperwork because she was concerned about record-keeping irregularities. She made me promise not to mention it to anyone else." October 7th or 8th, right before Emily sent her email to regional administration about the missing animal documentation. Robert Griffin's account placed him at the main ranger station for most of October 14th. "I was handling administrative duties," he told investigators. "Paperwork, scheduling, routine management tasks. I was at my desk until approximately 1:50 p.m. when I drove out to inspect a distant checkpoint station." The checkpoint he referenced was about 30 kilometers from the main station, in the opposite direction from where Emily had been patrolling. Griffin stated he'd returned to the main station around 5:30 p.m., learned about Emily's missed radio check, and immediately begun coordinating the search operation. But investigators found a problem with Griffin's timeline. Security camera footage from the main station's vehicle entrance showed Griffin's official Park Service pickup truck leaving at 1:52 p.m., exactly as he'd stated. However, the truck didn't return until 5:34 p.m. 3 hours and 42 minutes for a trip that should have taken no more than 2 hours round trip, even accounting for time spent at the checkpoint. When confronted with the discrepancy, Griffin adjusted his statement. "I must have misremembered. After checking the distant station, I drove to a secondary location to verify some trail markers. Standard maintenance inspection. I didn't think to mention it because it seemed routine." Investigators asked which trail markers. Griffin provided a location. Rangers were sent to verify. The trail markers in question showed no signs of recent maintenance or inspection. There were no inspection logs for that location on October 14th. Griffin was asked to explain the contradiction. He became defensive. "I drive all over this sector on any given day. I may have confused which day I checked which location. It was weeks ago now." The voice analysis of the body camera recording came back with results that further complicated the investigation. The audio forensics laboratory had cleaned up the recording, filtering out ambient noise and enhancing the vocal tracks. The male voice saying, "You don't understand what you've done," was analyzed for vocal characteristics, pitch, resonance, cadence, regional accent markers. Comparison samples were obtained from all 3 rangers. Mark Holloway provided a sample immediately. David Coleman did the same. Robert Griffin, after some hesitation and a consultation with a union representative, also submitted to voice recording. The analysis eliminated David Coleman entirely. His vocal characteristics didn't match any of the sounds on Emily's camera. Mark Holloway's voice showed some similarities in pitch range, but the forensic linguist noted significant differences in speech patterns and phoneme production. Possible, the report stated, but unlikely. Robert Griffin's voice analysis produced a different result. The forensic report noted, Subject Griffin's voice shows a 73% acoustic match with the male voice recorded on the body camera. Pitch, resonance, and regional accent markers are highly consistent. While this does not constitute definitive identification, the probability is significant. Investigators obtained warrants to examine financial records. Emily Carson's bank accounts showed nothing unusual. A ranger's salary, modest savings, regular monthly expenses. Mark Holloway's finances were similarly unremarkable. David Coleman, as a newer employee, showed even less financial activity. Robert Griffin's accounts told a different story. Monthly cash deposits ranging from $8,000 to $12,000 appeared regularly over the previous 18 months. His official Park Service salary was $4,200 per month. The additional income represented more money than his official pay. When questioned, Griffin explained the deposits as income from consulting work and freelance environmental assessments. Investigators requested documentation. Griffin promised to provide invoices and contracts. Days passed. No documentation arrived. When pressed, Griffin's attorney stated the records had been stored in a home office that suffered water damage and might be difficult to recover. Investigators weren't buying it. A subpoena for Griffin's home came next. The search of Robert Griffin's residence on November 9th produced documents that transformed the investigation entirely. Hidden in a filing cabinet in his garage were contracts, shipping manifests, and email printouts documenting a sophisticated illegal operation. Grizzly bear gallbladders bound for traditional medicine markets in Asia. Elk antlers purchased by collectors. Gray wolf pelts sold to private buyers. The documentation covered a 9-month period and represented approximately $90,000 in illegal wildlife trade. The operation worked through carefully constructed cover stories. Animals removed from the park under legitimate problem animal protocols would be processed through official channels. But additional animals taken illegally would be documented using falsified paperwork that made them appear legitimate. The extra bear carcasses Emily had discovered weren't mistakes. They were the visible edge of a systematic poaching operation. Robert Griffin's name appeared on multiple documents, but he wasn't working alone. The contracts referenced communications with someone identified only by initials, M.H. Mark Holloway's initials. Investigators confronted Holloway with the evidence. His reaction was immediate shock. "I don't know anything about this. M.H. could be anyone. Those aren't my initials exclusively." But the circumstantial evidence was mounting. Holloway had been Emily's partner, giving him knowledge of her movements and patrol schedules. He had access to all the same records Emily would have been investigating. His radio silence on October 14th coincided exactly with the critical time period. And now his initials appeared in documentary evidence of the very crimes Emily had been investigating. On November 12th, investigators discovered another piece of the puzzle. Among Robert Griffin's seized documents was a printed email exchange. The messages had been deleted from Griffin's official email account, but had been printed before deletion. The exchange was dated October 11th, 3 days before Emily disappeared. Griffin had written to someone, "She knows too much. You said you'd handle this." The response, received the same day, "I'll talk to her. Maybe she'll back off." The messages were signed only with initials. Griffin's messages ended with RG. The responses ended with MH. The case seemed complete. Robert Griffin had been running an illegal wildlife trafficking operation. Emily Carson had discovered evidence of the scheme and reported it to regional administration. Griffin had panicked and reached out to his co-conspirator, Mark Holloway. One of them, probably Griffin, based on the voice analysis, had confronted Emily in the backcountry on October 14th. When she refused to drop her investigation, the situation had escalated. The incident captured on her body camera was the moment everything went wrong. The GPS data showed the timeline. Emily had been in that static location for over an hour, probably during some kind of confrontation or negotiation. When it became clear she wouldn't be silenced, Griffin had made a terrible choice. He'd moved her body to the ravine, attempted to stage an accident scene, and discarded her camera without realizing it was still recording. Mark Holloway's role remained unclear. Was he an active participant in Emily's death, or just a co-conspirator in the trafficking scheme who hadn't known Griffin would resort to violence? The MH messages suggested he'd been asked to talk to her, not to harm her. On November 14th, arrest warrants were issued for both men. Robert Griffin was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and multiple counts of illegal wildlife trafficking. Mark Holloway was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, accessory after the fact, and wildlife trafficking. Both men were taken into custody without incident. Griffin invoked his right to remain silent immediately and refused to make any statement without his attorney present. Holloway, pale and shaking, kept repeating, "I didn't kill her. I didn't know he was going to hurt her. You have to believe me." The prosecutor prepared for trial. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The body camera audio, the GPS data proving the body had been moved, Griffin's unexplained absence from the station during the critical time period, the financial records showing $90,000 in illegal income, the MH emails suggesting conspiracy between Griffin and Holloway. But 3 days after the arrests, David Coleman requested an urgent meeting with investigators. He had information, he said, that would change their understanding of the case entirely. What he told them would unravel the prosecution's theory and redirect the investigation towards someone they hadn't yet considered. Coleman arrived at the county sheriff's office on November 17th, accompanied by his own attorney. He looked nervous but determined. The lead investigator, Detective Sarah Morrison, met him in an interview room equipped with video recording equipment. "I need to tell you something I should have mentioned earlier," Coleman began. "It's about the MH in those emails. It's not Mark Holloway." Morrison leaned forward. "How do you know?" Coleman pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Because a week before Emily disappeared, she showed me something. She'd been building her case about the missing animals for weeks, and she wanted someone else to see what she'd found. She trusted me because I was new, not part of whatever was happening." He unfolded the paper. It was a photocopy of an official authorization form for the destruction of a problem grizzly bear. The form was dated July 2020. The signature at the bottom read, "M. Henderson, Regional Coordinator." "Emily told me she'd found multiple documents signed by this Henderson person," Coleman explained. "Authorization forms for animal removals, transfer documents, disposal certifications. She said Henderson was approving removals that didn't match the incident reports. She suspected he was part of the scheme, using his position in regional administration to provide official cover for illegal operations." Morrison pulled out her phone and called the National Park Service regional office. 20 minutes later, she had confirmation. Michael Henderson was a real person, a 47-year-old administrator with the Park Service's Regional Wildlife Management Division. He had been employed by the Park Service for 19 years. His position gave him authorization to approve problem animal protocols across multiple parks, including Yellowstone. And critically, he was the person who should have received and acted upon Emily Carson's October 8th email reporting protocol violations. Investigators pulled Henderson's employment records and communications logs. The October 8th email from Emily had indeed reached his office. Henderson had marked it as received in the system, but no investigation had been initiated. No follow-up had been scheduled. The email had simply been filed away in a digital folder labeled Personnel Concerns Closed. Henderson had buried Emily's complaint. Phone records were subpoenaed. Between October 9th and October 14th, Robert Griffin's cell phone showed 6 calls to a number registered to Michael Henderson. The calls ranged from 3 minutes to 14 minutes in length. All occurred during evening hours, when both men were presumably off-duty. On October 13th, the day before Emily disappeared, Henderson had called Griffin 3 times. The final call lasted 22 minutes and ended at 9:47 p.m. Investigators brought Michael Henderson in for questioning on November 19th. Unlike Griffin, who had immediately lawyered up, Henderson agreed to speak with detectives. He seemed calm, almost amused by the situation. "I receive hundreds of emails from park personnel," Henderson explained. "Rangers often have concerns about procedures or documentation. Most of these concerns are resolved through routine clarification. Emily Carson's email seemed like another case of a well-intentioned employee misunderstanding complex protocols." Detective Morrison placed copies of the MH emails on the table. These are communications between Robert Griffin and someone initialed MH. They discuss Emily Carson knowing too much. They discuss handling the situation. The dates are October 11th, 3 days before Emily disappeared. Henderson barely glanced at them. "I have no idea what those are. MH could be anyone." "Your phone records show 6 calls with Robert Griffin in the days following Emily's email complaint," Morrison continued, "including 3 calls the day before she disappeared. What were you discussing?" Henderson's calm cracked slightly. "I may have called Griffin about scheduling matters, or budget allocations. I can't recall specific conversations from a month ago." "Emily Carson sent you detailed evidence of illegal wildlife trafficking operating in your jurisdiction. Instead of investigating, you buried the complaint and called the man she was accusing. Why?" Henderson stood abruptly. "I think I should speak with an attorney before continuing this conversation." The interview ended, but Henderson's sudden shift from cooperation to legal counsel spoke volumes. Financial investigators began examining Henderson's bank records. The results proved even more damning than Griffin's. Over the past 3 years, Henderson had received deposits totaling more than $500,000 beyond his official salary. The money came through a complex series of transfers, shell companies, and cash transactions clearly designed to obscure its origins. Robert Griffin had been the ground-level operator in Yellowstone, but Henderson was the kingpin who made the entire scheme possible. His position in regional administration gave him access to documentation from multiple parks. He could authorize removals, approve transfers, and ensure that paperwork told whatever story he needed it to tell. The realization that Michael Henderson was the primary architect of the trafficking scheme forced investigators to completely reassess the events of October 14th. Robert Griffin's voice on Emily's body camera, his unexplained absence from the ranger station, and the GPS evidence proving he'd moved her body all remained factually accurate. But the motive and conspiracy now extended far beyond a local operation. Emily Carson hadn't just threatened a small-time poaching scheme. She'd endangered a multi-year, multi-state criminal enterprise worth over $500,000, and she'd sent her evidence directly to the one person who had the most to lose from exposure. Detective Morrison obtained warrants for Henderson's home and office on November 20th. The search of his residence in Bozeman, Montana, produced a laptop computer that Henderson had apparently forgotten to secure. Digital forensic specialists recovered deleted emails that painted a damning picture of the conspiracy. On October 9th, the day after Emily's email arrived, Henderson had written to Griffin, "We have a problem. Carson has documentation of the July removals and is asking questions about authorization discrepancies. She's filed a formal complaint requesting external review. This could trigger a federal audit." Already done. Marked it as resolved personnel concern. But she's not going to drop this. She's been building a file for weeks. What do we do? Let me think. I'll call you tonight. The email chain continued over the following days. Henderson and Griffin discussed options. Initially, Henderson suggested they could discredit Emily, claim she'd misunderstood the documentation, suggest she was a disgruntled employee with a grudge. But Griffin reported back that Emily had shown her evidence to others, including David Coleman. She'd created backup documentation. She wasn't going to be easily silenced through bureaucratic maneuvering. The tone of the emails shifted. Henderson wrote on October 12th, "If she takes this to the federal level, we're both finished. I've spent 19 years building my position. I'm not losing everything because some idealistic ranger thinks she's saving the world." Griffin's response, "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting you need to convince her to drop this. Use whatever leverage you have. Tell her she's misunderstanding the protocols. Tell her she'll damage her career. Tell her whatever you need to tell her, but make this go away." The final email in the chain was dated October 13th at 10:47 p.m., sent after Henderson's 22-minute phone call with Griffin. The message was brief. "Do what has to be done. No more emails. Call only from the burner." Burner referred to a prepaid cell phone. Investigators had already noticed that Griffin's phone records showed no calls to Henderson after October 13th, despite clear evidence the two men continued coordinating. They'd switched to untraceable communications. But the deleted emails provided something even more valuable than proof of conspiracy. They revealed a detail about Emily Carson that explained her final words on the body camera recording. In an email dated October 13th, Henderson had asked Griffin, "Are you sure she hasn't already gone federal? If she's copied her evidence to anyone outside the Park Service, we're already compromised." Griffin had replied, "I checked the logs. She sent one email to your office on October 8th. Nothing else external. If we handle this now, we can contain it." But Griffin was wrong. Emily Carson had sent a second email, one that didn't go through official Park Service channels. Investigators found evidence of it on Emily's personal laptop, which had been secured from her apartment after her death but hadn't been examined closely until now. On October 13th, the same day Henderson was pressuring Griffin to do what has to be done, Emily had composed a detailed message to the FBI's Environmental Crimes Task Force. The email included attachments, scanned documents, photographs of authorization forms, spreadsheets showing the discrepancies between official incident reports and actual animal removals, and a summary of her findings. She'd sent the email at 8:34 p.m. from her personal computer. The subject line read, Evidence of federal wildlife trafficking operation, Yellowstone National Park. Emily had gone federal, but neither Henderson nor Griffin knew it when they made their plans for October 14th. This explained Emily's words on the body camera recording. "You can't hide this. The letter has already been sent." She wasn't referring to her October 8th email to Henderson, which he'd already buried. She was talking about the FBI report. Even if they silenced her, the evidence would still surface. But Griffin, acting on Henderson's instructions to handle the problem, had already committed to his course of action. The recording captured the moment he realized his mistake. Investigators now had the full picture of what happened on October 14th. Robert Griffin, under pressure from Henderson to stop Emily's investigation, had tracked her to her patrol area near Hidden Lake. He'd confronted her at approximately 2:28 p.m. when her body camera somehow activated and began recording. The acoustic analysis suggested the camera had been jolted during the initial confrontation, triggering its auto-record function when Griffin grabbed Emily's vest. She'd managed to unfasten the camera mount during the struggle, probably hoping to preserve evidence, and the camera had fallen to the ground where it continued recording audio for 17 minutes. The initial sounds on the recording captured Griffin's attempt to threaten or persuade Emily to drop her investigation. "You don't understand what you've done." His words weren't a threat of imminent violence at that moment. They were an angry warning that she'd endangered his operation, his income, his entire arrangement with Henderson. Emily's response showed her defiance. "I understand perfectly." The GPS data revealed what happened during the next 76 minutes. Griffin had kept Emily at that location, probably continuing to pressure her, perhaps hoping she'd agree to some kind of deal. The body camera's audio captured fragments of this confrontation. At one point, Emily could be heard saying, "You can't hide this. The letter has already been sent." That statement sealed her fate. If the evidence had already been sent to authorities, then silencing Emily wouldn't protect Griffin or Henderson anymore. But Griffin had already assaulted a federal ranger in the backcountry. He'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Emily could testify about the confrontation, about his admission of involvement in the trafficking scheme, about everything. Griffin made a choice. The body camera's audio didn't capture the specific moment, falling silent for long stretches after the battery drained. But the GPS data told the story. At 3:52 p.m., over an hour after the confrontation began, Emily's position suddenly moved 1.2 kilometers in 8 minutes. The forensic evidence suggested Griffin had carried or dragged Emily's body to the ravine location, a spot he'd probably scouted earlier as a plausible accident site. He'd arranged the scene to look like a fall from the cliff above. He'd removed Emily's body camera, probably noticing it was detached and deciding it was too risky to leave with the body. What Griffin didn't know was that the camera's battery had another few minutes of life left. As he moved away from the location where he'd discarded it, the camera recorded his footsteps retreating into the forest. At 17 minutes exactly, the battery finally died. The one piece of evidence that didn't fit cleanly into the narrative was Emily's radio, found on her body with the channel switched from the standard working frequency to a rarely used reserve channel. Investigators theorized this had happened accidentally during the struggle or when Griffin moved the body, but the detail remained somewhat anomalous. Henderson's role in the actual events of October 14th remained circumstantial. The deleted emails proved he'd pressured Griffin to handle the Emily situation, but he hadn't explicitly ordered murder. Henderson's defense attorneys would certainly argue that do what has to be done meant convince Emily to drop her investigation through legitimate means, not kill her. But the financial evidence, the buried complaint, the phone records, and the progression of emails created a damning picture of conspiracy. Henderson had created the problem by building a criminal enterprise. He'd received Emily's evidence and concealed it. He'd pressured Griffin to act. And even if he hadn't specifically ordered Emily's death, his actions had created the circumstances that led to it. On November 23rd, federal prosecutors announced charges against Michael Henderson: conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, interstate wildlife trafficking, money laundering, and public corruption. The charging documents ran to 47 pages. Robert Griffin faced first-degree murder charges along with his own trafficking counts. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His voice on the body camera, his unexplained absence during the critical time period, the GPS data proving he'd moved Emily's body, the financial records showing his income from illegal sales. Griffin's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal. Griffin would testify against Henderson in exchange for a reduction from first-degree murder to second-degree. The prosecutor's office considered the offer. Henderson was arguably the bigger target, the architect of the entire scheme. But the evidence against Henderson on the murder conspiracy was largely circumstantial, while Griffin's guilt was nearly certain. After 2 days of negotiation, the plea offer was rejected. The prosecutor believed they could convict both men without needing Griffin's testimony. The case would go to trial. Mark Holloway, initially arrested as a co-conspirator, was released after investigators concluded the MH initials referred to Henderson, not Holloway. His radio silence on October 14th had been exactly what he claimed: routine work in an area with poor reception. His connection to Emily had been professional partnership, nothing more. But Holloway had known something was wrong. In the days before Emily disappeared, she'd shared some of her suspicions with him. Not the full scope of her investigation, but enough that he knew she was looking into documentation irregularities. After her death, Holloway had been afraid to speak up, terrified that whoever had killed Emily might target him if he revealed what he knew. It was Holloway who'd made the anonymous call to investigators on November 18th, suggesting they look more closely at Michael Henderson. He'd been too frightened to come forward openly, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to remain completely silent. David Coleman had played a simpler but equally crucial role. Emily had trusted him with her suspicions because he was new to the sector, clearly not part of any existing corruption. His testimony about the documents Emily had shown him, particularly the authorization forms signed by Henderson, helped establish the scope of the trafficking operation. The 3 additional rangers arrested in the initial sweep of the trafficking investigation had been minor participants. They'd been aware that some animal removals weren't entirely legitimate, but they'd convinced themselves these were just bureaucratic shortcuts, not serious crimes. All 3 accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony against Griffin and Henderson. The trial began in August 2022, 22 months after Emily Carson's body was found in that ravine in Yellowstone's wilderness. The prosecution presented the body camera audio to the jury. Even with the prosecution's careful framing that avoided graphic details, the impact was devastating. Hearing Emily's voice, defiant in the face of threats, knowing she had only minutes left to live, created a courtroom atmosphere of palpable tension. The GPS data was presented through expert testimony. A forensic analyst walked the jury through the timeline, explaining how the data proved Emily's body had been moved after death. The defense tried to argue the GPS device could have malfunctioned, but the expert demolished that theory with technical precision. The financial evidence took 3 days to present. Spreadsheets, bank records, transaction histories. The jury saw exactly how much money Griffin and Henderson had made from their scheme, and how carefully they'd tried to hide it. Henderson took the stand in his own defense. It was a calculated risk. He maintained he'd had no idea Griffin would harm Emily Carson. He claimed do what has to be done meant persuade her, not hurt her. He argued that his burial of Emily's complaint was a judgment call, not criminal obstruction. Simply a supervisor deciding an employee concern didn't warrant external investigation. The prosecution's cross-examination was surgical. They walked Henderson through every email, every phone call, every decision to conceal evidence. By the time it concluded, Henderson's calm facade had cracked completely. He'd grown defensive, angry, repeatedly insisting he'd done nothing wrong, even as the evidence piled higher around him. Griffin never testified. His attorneys advised silence, hoping to create reasonable doubt by forcing the prosecution to prove every element without any admissions from their client. But the strategy failed. The jury deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days. Robert Griffin was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and 12 counts of wildlife trafficking. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Griffin showed no emotion as the sentence was read. Michael Henderson was convicted on all counts except the primary conspiracy to commit murder charge. The jury concluded he'd created the circumstances and pressured Griffin to act, but they couldn't find beyond reasonable doubt that Henderson had specifically intended Emily's death. He was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. At 49 years old when sentenced, Henderson would be 84 before becoming eligible for release. The 3 Rangers who'd accepted plea deals received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. All 3 were permanently barred from federal employment. The FBI's investigation into the trafficking network Henderson had created expanded beyond Yellowstone. Evidence showed the FBI's investigation into the trafficking network Henderson had created expanded beyond Yellowstone. Evidence showed similar schemes had operated in 3 other national parks. 2 additional Park Service administrators were arrested. 4 wildlife brokers who'd purchased illegal animals faced federal charges. The entire network generated estimated revenue of more than $2 million over 5 years. Emily Carson's parents attended every day of the trial. Her father sat silently throughout, unable to speak about what had happened to his daughter. Her mother gave a brief statement after Griffin's sentencing. "Our daughter believed that protecting these wild places and the animals in them was worth dedicating her life to," she said, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. She never imagined that belief would cost her life, but she also never imagined that the greatest threat to the wilderness she loved would come from inside the very organization sworn to protect it. Mark Holloway left the National Park Service 6 months after the trial concluded. He now works as an environmental consultant for a nonprofit focused on wildlife protection. He declined multiple requests for interviews about Emily Carson, stating only that some losses are too profound for words. David Coleman remained with the Park Service. He was promoted to a position in the agency's Internal Affairs Division where he investigates potential corruption and misconduct. He's credited with helping develop new protocols for handling whistleblower complaints, specifically designed to prevent another situation where a complaint gets buried by a corrupt administrator. The 17 minutes of audio from Emily Carson's body camera was entered into evidence at trial but has never been publicly released. The FBI keeps the recording classified, respecting the Carson family's wishes that Emily's final moments remain private. But the transcript of the recording was made public as part of the trial record, allowing Emily's defiant words to stand as testimony to her courage. In the Yellowstone Ranger Station where Emily Carson once worked, her locker remains exactly as she left it on the morning of October 14, 2020. A photograph of her parents sits on the small shelf inside. Her favorite coffee mug, bearing a faded image of a grizzly bear, still holds pens and markers. The station's supervisor decided the locker would stay untouched, a memorial to a ranger who died protecting the wilderness she loved. The trafficking operation Emily Carson discovered has been completely dismantled. New oversight protocols now require multiple levels of authorization for any animal removal from national parks. Digital tracking systems monitor every permit, every authorization, every transfer of wildlife materials. Independent auditors conduct random reviews of documentation. The reforms came too late for Emily, but they've closed the loopholes that Henderson exploited. Yellowstone continues to protect its populations of grizzly bears, gray wolves, and other rare species. The animals Emily Carson worked to defend remain among the most carefully monitored wildlife in North America. Every time a ranger conducts a backcountry patrol in the northern sector, they pass near the ravine where Emily was found. Most of them pause there, even if just for a moment, remembering the colleague who paid the ultimate price for refusing to look away from corruption. Robert Griffin maintains his innocence despite the conviction. He's filed multiple appeals, all denied. He'll die in prison. Michael Henderson is incarcerated in a federal facility in Colorado. He's provided no further cooperation with authorities and has declined all interview requests. The $500,000 he made from the trafficking scheme was seized under asset forfeiture laws, distributed among wildlife conservation programs in the states where the crimes occurred. The Emily Carson Wildlife Protection Grant was established by her former colleagues. It provides funding for rangers and park employees who identify potential corruption or illegal activity and need legal support to report it safely. The fund ensures that future whistleblowers won't face the same isolation and risk that Emily encountered when she tried to do the right thing. October 14th is now observed at Yellowstone as a day of remembrance. Rangers pause at 2:22 p.m., the time of Emily's last radio contact, for a moment of silence. The tradition started informally, spread throughout the northern sector, and eventually became an unofficial practice across the entire park. The GoPro body camera that recorded 17 minutes after its owner could no longer speak is kept in a secure evidence facility. The device has been requested by multiple forensic training programs as a teaching tool, but the FBI has declined all requests. Some pieces of evidence, they've decided, should remain exactly where they are, preserved but not exploited. Emily Carson was 29 years old when she died. She'd spent 4 years protecting Yellowstone's wilderness, documenting its wildlife, sharing its beauty with thousands of followers who lived vicariously through her adventures. She could have ignored the discrepancies she found in those animal removal reports. She could have convinced herself it wasn't her problem, that someone else would eventually notice. She could have prioritized her own safety over her principles. She made a different choice. That choice cost her everything. But it also exposed a criminal enterprise that had operated undetected for years, protected dozens of animals from illegal killing, and forced systemic reforms that made every national park in America safer and more accountable. The last entry in Emily Carson's personal journal was dated October 13, 2020, the night before she died. Among routine notes about weather conditions and wildlife sightings, she'd written a single line that her parents found when they cleared out her apartment. If the truth only matters when it's safe, then it doesn't really matter at all. Those words are now engraved on a small memorial plaque at the Yellowstone Ranger Station where Emily worked. Every new ranger assigned to the northern sector sees them during orientation. Most of them stand there silently for a while, reading and rereading that simple statement, understanding what it meant to the woman who wrote it and what it cost her to live by it.